Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Lageson, Executive Secretary for the Committee on the Present Danger China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help being provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for more information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable content. Please subscribe to our Substack at presentdangerchina.substack.com and follow us on X at CPD for updates. Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is president of the Institute for the American Future, vice chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China, and host of Securing America on Real America's Voice Network.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Dee Dee. We are gathered together, dearly beloved, to talk about a very important facet in the unrestricted warfare of the Chinese Communist Party against the United States and others who love freedom. That would be in the course of what we call World War Xi, the Mideast Front in that war. The various partnerships and stratagems and initiatives the Chinese Communist Party is pursuing to establish its dominance in this particular region and to otherwise undermine that of the United States and our friends and allies, or what's left of them in this sensitive region. We have assembled an extraordinary cast of experts, as we try to do each week in these webinars, to bring to light aspects of the problems that we're covering that you probably are not going to be exposed to otherwise. That is our purpose. Our Committee on the Present Danger China has been in business for 6 years now, with this express service to the country in mind, to expose and illuminate and espouse strategies for countering the unrestricted warfare of the Chinese Communist Party. And for reasons that will become clear in the course of this program, there is, I think, hardly an area of the world in which more is on the line in this particular struggle, with the possible exception of the Western Pacific, than is true of the Middle East. And this is by design, ladies and gentlemen, as our speakers will, I think, illuminate. We call it World War Xi because what has brought us to this pass in the Mideast, among other places, is the strategic arson of Xi Jinping, where he is beavering away with his friends to tie us down, to distract us, to deplete our resources, and most especially our arsenal, as preparation, we believe, for his ultimate objective, which is to secure China's preeminent position, yes, in the Far East, but worldwide, and displace, perhaps in the course of displacing, destroy this country. So, our object today is to equip you to understand how the Middle East fits into this larger strategy and how vitally important it is that we comport ourselves in this region with clarity about the stakes, with a deliberation about what we can and must do about it, and we hope with an effectiveness that the times demand. We're going to start with, as we often do these webinars, Our friend Captain James Fanell, United States Navy retired, a very distinguished and highly decorated naval intelligence officer. During his time in uniform, he rose through the ranks to captain and became the chief of intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Captain Fanell is the co-author with Dr. Bradley Thayer of an extraordinarily important book, Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. We caught up with him for our television program, Securing America, yesterday as we speak, and he was kind enough to give us an overview, really, a very compelling introduction to today's topic. And we're going to go to the videotape now for the purposes of taking that aboard.
There's no question that China has strategic global ambitions. They state that almost on a daily basis with their global defense initiative, global strategic initiative. They have a number of initiatives that have global nature, their digital domain and things of that nature. So China has global ambitions, and folks need to understand that when China wants to restore, talks about restoring themselves, they're talking about restoring themselves to being the rulers of the earth, which they think is their historic right. So that's the first kind of thing we need to understand. Second, we need to go back 10 years when Xi came to power, over 10 years, 12 years now, and he made it very clear that he was going to expand China's influence and actions into the Middle East, starting with the Belt and Road Initiative, the building of a military base in Djibouti that they're using now for several years to resupply their naval forces that have been operating in the Gulf of Aden since December of 2008, nonstop, continuously, with 3 warships every day of the year in that last 16 years. And then they've done a number of things. They've done humanitarian evacuations of their personnel on their naval vessels out of Oman, out of Libya, when the crisis was in Libya in the Middle East. They've exercised for the last 4 or 5 years with the Russians and the Iranians in the Gulf of Oman and the Gulf of Aden. They've operated an exercise with the Russians in the Eastern Mediterranean, off of Israel and Syria and north of Egypt. And just this week, they conducted what they call exercise Eagles of Civilization 2025, where they brought out People's Liberation Army Air Force J-10 Charlie fighters, YU-20, their newest aerial refuelers, and then the KJ-500 early warning aircraft to operate and exercise with the Egyptian Air Force, who was operating MiG-29s. So this is just this week, and you have to ask yourself, why is the People's Republic of China exercising militarily with the Egyptians, who we pay billions to every year in basically money so that we can ensure that the Suez Canal stays open? And as we've learned over this last year with the Houthi attacks on our naval vessels and commercial shipping, that most of that traffic goes to Europe, not a majority of it goes to America. But we as Americans have been providing the services of the world's policemen to that region. And so it's a vital sea link. It's important for the safety and security of our European friends and allies. It does provide America some stuff, some material, but it's really for Europe. And so when that's at risk, we have to ask ourselves, why is China there? There's also rumors and talk of what China's doing to supply the Iranians with nuclear technology. Maybe it's the last few bits and pieces of information that would help them finally be able to produce these nuclear weapons. And as Sam Faddis, a colleague here on these channels, he said, we don't really know because the CIA has been so decimated. So we have some serious concerns. I predominantly, for the most of my career, focused on what the Chinese are doing in Asia and the Indo-Pacific, but we have to recognize that they have aspirations that are global, and that critical area of the Middle East, they would like to be able to push us out, displace the United States, and have access and control of that supply of petroleum so they can meet their strategic needs. And that's really the significant thing. And they're coordinating and operating with the Russians. So these are not opposed forces, these are combined forces. And when you think about Iranian and Russian and Chinese naval forces, now they weren't a great number, they weren't a big force, but that's not the point. The point is they're practicing tactics, techniques, and procedures on how they cooperate, communicate, and would conduct operations. And I find it very interesting that those three nations were doing this at the time that the U.S. Navy, my Navy, is in the Red Sea getting attacked by Houthi rebels that may be supplied with missiles and drone technology that ultimately comes from China as well and Russia. So we are in a Cold War, if you want to call it that, whatever you want to call it. But we are in a contest, an existential struggle between communism versus freedom, and we need to wake up and recognize that. And that should affect, how we make decisions on how we defend ourselves. And I think this president, the current president, has turned the corner and is marching away from the decline that the Obama and Biden years took our nation in terms of national security.
No, thank you. This is, as usual, an extraordinarily comprehensive, if very brief, introduction to the topic. We're going to drill down on a number of the points that Jim just made with our other panelists today, starting with Rabbi Pesach Wolicki, a great friend of our Committee on the Present Danger China, as well as an extraordinary resource based now in Israel, where he is the executive director of what I consider to be one of the most important information warfare operations on either side of the Atlantic. It's called Israel365 Action. He's also the co-host of a podcast, Shoulder to Shoulder, and a columnist for the Jerusalem Post. He has a very impressive library of video commentaries and analyses, including a recent one on the subject we've asked him to talk about here today. He's joining us by video as well, expressly produced for this program. For that, we're very grateful. It's about a topic that he's quite seized with, as I think should we all, and I believe Captain Fanell alluded to it in passing. The topic is, has Egypt changed sides? The exercises with the Chinese and Russians and other developments in Egypt at the moment give rise to real concerns about what the implications of what's happening there might be for Israel, but also America and the region. Let's go to Pesach Wolicki's video now.
To be a part of it, and I've been asked to speak about the connection between the Chinese Communist Party and Egypt, and this comes at a very auspicious time because just 2 days ago, China, the PLA, the Chinese Communist Party Air Force, just wrapped up its first ever joint air exercise with the Egyptians. And when something like that happens, we have to ask ourselves both why it happened, but also why we know about it. I should note that only a week earlier, the Egyptian Navy conducted a joint exercise with the Russian Navy. But joint military exercises with the Chinese Communist Party are not new between the Egyptians and the Chinese. Back in 2018, there was a major joint naval exercise between the Chinese Communist Party Navy and the Egyptian Navy. But I want to move away from the military for a second and pull back the camera and talk about the economic cooperation, because with China, economics is just another form of warfare. In as recently as May 2024, there was an announcement of a new large container terminal being built at the Ein Sokhna port on the Red Sea, developed by an international consortium led by China's Hutchinson Ports. It's set to start operations this year in 2025. And in December of 2024, just a few months ago, the Chinese steel company Jinfeng unveiled plans to develop a state-of-the-art industrial complex in the Ein Sokhna integrated zone, which is part of the Suez Canal economic zone as well. And Hutchison Ports, this state-owned Chinese company, also operates two other vital ports, the Alexandria port and the El Dechelia port. And both ports are essential to Egypt's commercial activity. The Alexandria port alone handles nearly 60% of Egypt's foreign trade. So you see here that the Chinese Communist Party basically operates the ports and operates and to a certain extent owns many of the key ports in the Suez Canal area. Egypt is a very important country in China's Belt and Road Initiative, and its plans to control international shipping. Now, when we look back to the military side and pulling back the camera a bit more to think about China's wider relationships that end up reaching into Egypt, we know that a couple of years ago, the Chinese Communist Party signed a 25-year cooperation deal, a strategic cooperation deal with the mullahs in Tehran, with Iran. And that included the Chinese Communist Party buying large quantities of Iranian oil, and that's really what has bankrolled the Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and all of the other nefarious activity of the Iranians. So, of course, Hamas is funded by the Iranian money, but the Chinese Communist Party influence on Hamas through Egypt is much more direct than simply the funds that flow through Iran, because what we've discovered, what we now know since the war of October 7th, is that an extensive tunnel network of tunnels, besides the tunnels within Gaza, there were large tunnels running from Egypt under the Philadelphia corridor into the southern part of the Gaza Strip, into the Rafah area. Some of the tunnels in that area are large enough to drive an 18-wheeler through. And all of the weapons and all of the equipment, all of the materials that funded Hamas and built Hamas and allowed Hamas to build its war machine all came through those tunnels under the Egyptian border, or they came through the Egyptian border itself. That entire border has been governed for years by Sisi's son, who used it as a way to make billions of dollars, controlling the flow of goods through there. So to say that Egypt turned a blind eye or was complicit in the arming of Hamas is an understatement. Egypt was actively involved in it. They were controlling the supply lines, essentially, to get weapons to the Egyptians. And what does this have to do with China? Well, we know that early in the war against Hamas, when Israel first went into Gaza, and they were discovering large weapons caches that Hamas, that were owned by Hamas, they discovered large quantities of recently manufactured Chinese weaponry that were in there. So we know that the Chinese have this relationship with the Iranians. We know they have a working relationship with the Egyptians. And if you put all the pieces together, and the only real way to get this type of weaponry into the Gaza Strip is through the Egyptian border. And you put all the pieces together, and we realize that this China-Egypt relationship played a pivotal role in allowing for the funding and building of Hamas and its capabilities. So when we think about who Egypt is, and this is a really important issue. It's an issue that I've been on now for a while in some of my published columns and my videos. That Egypt really has changed sides. They probably changed sides a while ago under our noses. They're very good at hedging and playing all sides. Some people interpret their relationship with China as something they're using in leverage with the relationship to the United States. But I think that undersells it. I don't think it's simply leverage for the United States. I think that they really have joined the other side. They've joined the other axis. When we look at the Arab world and we see Arab Muslim nations like the Saudis and the Emiratis, who seem to a certain extent to actually be interested in some sort of engagement with the West that's peaceful. And we see, in Jordan where they're joining the countries that are outlawing the Muslim Brotherhood, and Egypt has done so as well. At the same time, the Egyptians have been getting more and more integrated with the China-Russia Iran axis. And even though we view them as a kind of moderate actor who still receives, they're the second largest recipient of military aid from the United States after Israel, they really are more and more in bed with the Chinese Communist Party. I think this issue of the shipping lanes and the control of the Suez Canal is something that really needs to be addressed and really needs to be talked about, because with everything, if we're going to try to rein in the Chinese Communist Party at any point, if Egypt is going to be, in cooperation with the West in any way, the ownership stake that the Chinese Communist Party has on the Suez Canal is a strategic problem for the entire Western world. Again, thank you so much for including me in this webinar, and God bless you all.
Bye. This is troubling and important development manifest by the day, as these exercises indicate, but clearly of some duration now, and the implications of it, as Rabbi Wolicki has made clear, are profound. We'll talk more about aspects of that, I'm sure, in the Q&A to come. But we're going to hear from a couple of other guests, several of whom will also be joining us by video. One of them was with us last week, I'm very pleased to say, and has made a return appearance by popular demand. Lieutenant Colonel Gaffney Lalari is his name. This is in the United States Air Force foreign area officer who actually specialized in the Middle East, though he's also deeply knowledgeable about what's going on elsewhere, notably in Taiwan and its surrounding region, where he now resides. He is a former fellow in Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and is currently a visiting researcher at the Institute of National Defense and Security Research, associated with the Taiwanese government as well. We've asked Vermont to address several of our speakers have touched on, and that is the Houthi rebels, as they're known, proxies for Iran, operating in Yemen and waging war against not only commercial shipping from countries with whom they are not aligned, and China would be one of those countries, by the way, but the United States Navy as well, elements of which are now in a slugfest with this ragtag rebel group, trying to suppress its drone and missile and other forms of attack against shipping, both naval and commercial, and the effective control that the Houthis are now exercising over the Red Sea, and yes, as we've just heard, the Suez Canal as well. Let's go to Gaffney Lalari's video now.
Well, thanks again, Frank, for letting me talk about Yemen in this episode. It's an important topic, and I'll do a quick summary, and then I'll cover some of the important aspects of it in terms of China and why is it important from my point of view, living in Taiwan. We all know that China is helping a lot of revolutionary groups, including terrorist groups around the world. And last year, we had a lot of discussion about how China was providing support to Hamas. And in the recent weeks, we've heard that China is providing Russia not only weapons, but possibly soldiers as part of their support to Russia's attack against Ukraine. In this broadcast, I'm going to cover how China has been helping the Houthi terrorists attack international shipping, the U.S. Navy, and of course, Israel. What are the Houthis doing? They're doing these attacks supposedly because Israel is attacking Hamas, but it's gone way beyond that in terms of what they've been trying to do. So let's talk about the damage that they've done. From their first attack on the 19th of October, 2023 until last week, they've sunk 2 ships, they've hijacked 2 ships, they've attacked over 140 ships, and at least 30 ships have been damaged, even though there is an allied presence to protect them from these attacks. And also, the Israeli missile defense system has been used several times to protect Israel. Now, in terms of casualties, the following people have died: a Vietnamese, 2 Filipino sailors, 2 Israeli civilians, and almost 200 people injured. On the U.S. side, 3 U.S. Navy personnel have died, 2 SEALs, and 1 Navy sailor. It's been going on for almost 2 years now, or a year and a half, but still the costs are high in terms of the shipping. U.S. equipment, we've lost almost over 22 MQ-9s, and we lost a FA-18 Super Hornet in a friendly fire incident. There are 2 military operations going on against Yemen, or against the Houthis in Yemen. One is called Operation Prosperity Guardian, started in December 2023. It's a multinational freedom of navigation combined operation, and it's with the United Kingdom, Bahrain, Canada, France, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, Seychelles, and Spain. Many other countries have joined as well, but those are the first players when it started. The second operation is called Operation Poseidon Archer, started in January 2024, and its focus is on the strikes that are being done against the Houthis in Yemen, mainly by U.S. and U.K. forces. The Houthis use a variety of weapons. They have a Tufan, which is a surface-to-surface missile, which can range over 1,000 miles. They have a cruise missile from the Iranian-type missiles, Quds-2, which is also another ballistic missile that can strike Israel, and Samad 3 and 4. They are UAV loitering munitions that also can strike Israel. They have Wa'id drones, which are similar to Iran's Shahed 136, with a range of over 1,600 miles. And finally, they have naval drones that are used to have explosives on them and ram the ships. So where does China fit in? China fits in this way. Around a week ago, the U.S. State Department accused China and Russia with militarily aiding the Houthis. This is important because Iran's ability to help Yemen has been degraded by sanctions, and Russia and China have been stepping up their assistance. State Department spokesman Tammy Bruce said recently, "It is clear that Beijing and China-based companies provide key economic and technical support to regimes like Russia, North Korea, and Iran and its proxies. The CCP continues to enable these regimes, whether it be through the provision of dual-use items Russia needs to sustain its war in Ukraine, North Korea's ballistic missile development, or Iran's support of terrorism across the Middle East, that these two countries, Russia and China, are helping the Houthis." Now, specifically, what is China doing? 2 Chinese-based companies were sanctioned last year by the U.S. for providing dual-use materials, components needed to manufacture, maintain, and deploy an arsenal of advanced missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles against U.S. and allied interests. A report by the Foundation for Defense of Democracy stated that the Houthis were using weapons made in China for their attacks on shipping in the Red Sea in exchange for Chinese ships having safe passage through the Red Sea. Another report from Israel's I-24 News stated that China provided Houthis with, quote, advanced components and guidance equipment for their missiles. A lot of this help occurred after the Houthi leaders visited China in 2023 and 2024 to establish secretive supply chains, and the group was able to obtain advanced components and guidance equipment for their missiles. The report also claimed that the Houthis plan to utilize the Chinese weapon components to produce hundreds of cruise missiles capable of striking Persian Gulf states, including Israel. Furthermore, maritime data confirms that China, quote, China-associated ships are continuing to navigate the Red Sea shipping lanes without being targeted, though a Houthi targeting error reportedly led to an attack on a Chinese-linked oil tanker in March of last year. The Houthis have previously said they would avoid targeting ships linked to China, which purchased 90% of Iran's illegal oil exports, helping counter sanctions imposed on the country's energy sector. Now, one of the companies named is called Changchuang Satellite Technology Corporation, and they've been providing geospatial intelligence to the Houthis, which target not only commercial shipping, but also U.S. warships in the Red Sea. And the U.S. government has complained to China about this support for providing high-resolution satellite imagery to this group. This group also has provided similar technology to the Wagner Group while they were involved in the invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago now. In conclusion, I wanted to point out that the international shipping in the Red Sea has dropped 75%, and this has affected a lot of different countries from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, in the Suez Canal, Israel's Eilat port, and the oil and gas exports from the Middle East to Europe have greatly been affected. Why are these Chinese communist actions important? First of all, the Chinese Communist Party is setting the world on fire by these actions. They're helping the Hamas and the other terrorist groups. They're helping the Houthis. They're helping the Russians in Ukraine. By doing this, they also are thinning out U.S. forces available to Taiwan because the U.S. has to respond to these fires that are lit by the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP is depleting also U.S. sea-based missile defense assets. As we protect shipping in the Red Sea, we're losing more and more of our missile defense assets, which could be used in a future conflict against to protect Taiwan. And finally, the CCP's three-war strategy, which was an idea conceived in 2018 by some academics in one of the Chinese universities that talked about using this idea of creating wars around the world to divide and conquer U.S. forces so that Taiwan becomes more vulnerable. And finally, I'd like to end with two quotes. Elbridge Colby, the current Undersecretary for Defense Policy, said in October 2024, why would China help us address the Houthi problems when it obviously distracts and depletes us? Because we've been asking the Chinese to help us deal with the Houthi problems, and they obviously don't have an interest. And finally, the last quote I'd like to make is from Cleo Pascal, who says, for China, it's not a zero-sum game, it's a negative-sum game. They will win if the other side loses more. So the more we try to put out fires around the world, we become weaker and they become stronger relatively. That's all I have to present today. I hope it was interesting. Thanks again, Frank, for the opportunity.
Interesting, Colonel, but very helpful indeed in fleshing out this story of direct Chinese involvement in acts of war against our Navy and our interests in freedom of navigation, of course, as well as against Israel, its own ships, yes, but indeed the territory of Israel and its people have been targeted as well by the Houthis. So thank you for this contribution. We're going to turn next to Dr. David Wormser, a man whose expertise on the Middle East is well, unsurpassed, I believe. He brings to the topic not only a background as a naval intelligence officer, risen to the ranks before his retirement to that of a lieutenant commander in the Navy. He's also served in senior positions in the State Department, the National Security Council, and the State Department, advising on Middle East issues, not least. He is, these days, the director of the Middle East program at the Center for Security Policy, one of its senior analysts, and an invaluable contributor to the work of our Institute for the American Future, including the Victory Coalition that we also sponsor in addition to this one, the Committee on the Present Danger China. David, we've asked to speak about two interrelated national threats, one from Turkey, the other from Qatar. And as you will hear, both are very intimately involved in not only supporting Sharia supremacism with primarily Sunni extremists, very notably the Muslim Brotherhood, but also with Shiite ones through Qatar's close collaboration with Iran and the on-again, off-again relationship between the Turks and the Iranians. David's topic is how can we understand the developments that both of these nations are engaged in at the moment without taking into account their independent but mutual relationship with China. David, welcome back. It's so good to have you. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Frank. First of all, just one comment about Turkey and Qatar. directly. To really understand the relationship, you have to understand how Qatar looks at the world. They basically purchase workers to do everything they need done. They don't have people, but they have a lot of money. So essentially, they enslave people or they purchase services to get what they've done. And essentially, Turkey is now their rent-a-caliph. It essentially is the engine driving through Turkish manpower and Turkish history, Turkish capabilities, really an imperial expansion along their ideological lines through essentially a hired nation. Now, it's not unprecedented. That's how Turks got into the Middle East, whether it's the Mamluks or Seljuks or so forth. They were always brought in as the imperial arm, as the imperial administrative and imperial warrior angle of these governments that then employed them for their own expansion, later to find, though, that they took over. But that's just an aside to describe the relationship of Turkey and Qatar, because I really think you need to look at them now as one unit or one cooperative structure that operates as a unit. Now, let me go to a quote that seems unrelated at first, but I'll tie it back, and I think it will help begin to visualize the scale of strategic competition in the Middle East through Turkey and Qatar that China is doing. Yesterday, when we've all been following the India-Pakistan crisis and how close we are to war, and China weighed in very decisively, very quickly. This is what they said about India. The unilateral breaking of the Indus River water treaty by India against Pakistan is an unprovoked escalation. India is a tempestuous and childish nation. The only reason why we pay any attention to India is because of their most unwelcome export, the Indian people. Now they're threatening to create a humanitarian disaster in Pakistan, etc., etc. And then they go on. This and the fact that India is siding with the U.S. against the world in the trade war should be abundantly clear to everyone that India is a feeble-minded nation who are obsequious to the strong. The only way to deal with this type of bully is to stand firm and be ready to use violence. Now, this is not a very usual diplomatic response to a crisis. It doesn't even have the usual, we call on sides to or try to find some restraint or some. Why is this? Why is China reacting like this to India? Well, to really understand, you have to understand the strategic architecture that's emerging in the Middle East, especially as Iran gets weaker. And that strategic architecture was actually sort of outlined by Putin in his Valdai speech, the Sochi speech at the Valdai conference in October 5th, 2023, which, by the way, will tell you why China was helping Hamas and helping the Houthis beforehand even. And what we see is that he outlined the world breaking down. Putin outlined the world breaking down into this grand Western alliance that's anchored ultimately to China's Belt and Road. So you see how Putin already began to see that China is the real strategic core, the spine of this whole structure. And the Belt and Road is their instrument. And that Belt and Road extends into the Middle East and then also, very importantly, into North Africa. Now, in the Middle East, it actually begins to come up against some Russian concepts, but we'll leave Russia aside. I'm going to stick right now solely to the Chinese side of this. China has been working very carefully with Qatar and Turkey for 5 or 6 years to bring the entire structure from the Hindu Kush over to Istanbul under the Belt and Road Initiative, and to strategically support the Turks in its efforts to challenge and shut down Indian influence in that region. And that's part of the larger competition between the other great strategic corridors. So this is, first of all, how the Belt and Road fits into the Middle East. It's a strategic corridor that eventually goes to Qatar and through the whole area with their strategic alliance with Iran, that whole area all the way over through Turkey. And then from there, they have access, strategic access to the rest of the Middle East, especially if you add Egypt, as Captain Fanell mentioned, and so forth. If you add Egypt, then they really have this access to North Africa, and they also choke off anything from the south going to the north through Yemen. So you see this large axis with its little branches and essentially choking off every port, every strategic waterway, and every canal, the Suez Canal, through its alliances. Now, how India, again, fits into this. The alternative corridor to that, of course, is the IMEC corridor, which India deliberately, IMEC being the India-Middle East corridor. The India-Middle East corridor is a trade corridor in its sort of concept in the West. The Europeans are interested for that. But for the Indians, they've made it very clear this is a strategic corridor. And it's anchored to the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, and Jordan. So that is designed by India as a competition to the Belt and Road. So what happens here is that China has to derail that. China has to make sure that that doesn't become a competition for two reasons. One is it becomes the major east-west corridor in trade, Asia-Europe corridor. The second thing is it's literally a barrier to China moving into the Middle East and down toward Africa. It undermines the entire Belt and Road Initiative. So for this, Turkey becomes critical because Turkey is the mechanism through which China right now challenges Indian power. If you go back already to 2000, the Indians captured Turkish intelligence officers in India trying to whip up riots and an intifada, so to speak, an uprising of Indian Muslims, the 200 million Muslims that live in India. On top of it all, they saw how how Turkey was inciting Pakistan to escalate against India and inciting to subvert any order against the American forces in Afghanistan at the time. Because they understood that Afghanistan was a strategic pivot, first of all. Second of all, they understood that Pakistan is the core way through which to challenge India. And three, that India is the barrier to their being able to properly link up with the Belt and Road and create this strategic alliance with China. Again, keeping in mind, this all has this Qatari angle to it because Turkey is Qatar's rent-a-caliph. So now, if you understand that sort of large strategic competition, you understand a number of things. Number one, the first real rendition of the rise of this IMEC corridor was what threatened both Turkey and Iran, but especially Iran at the time, which was the growing rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the growing possibility of a strengthening of the Abraham Accords into much greater strategic cooperation that is ultimately what the IMEC corridor is echoing. And it's quite likely that one of the main considerations for Iran launching this attack, which is in a strategic cooperation agreement with China and has been since 2020 or 2021, is to essentially derail that movement. That by launching this war, they derail all this movement towards Saudi Arabia and Israeli rapprochement, and indeed it did derail it. Israel and Saudi Arabia have never recovered their emerging relationship from the October 7th events. And now you have the second thing, which is this war or potential war between India and Pakistan. And I think you have to understand that that is ultimately part of this Iranian Turkish, really, it's now a Qatari Turkish. The Iranians are strategically limping and going along with China and Russia and so forth. But this real Qatari Turkish threat that wants to link up to China, I think you have to look at it that way, that this is in part, again, a way to sabotage and undermine what is the strategic threat to the Belt and Road Initiative in the Middle East, which is, again, the Indian-Israeli UAE, potentially Saudi corridor, the IMEC corridor. By the way, links up also with Greece. One final aspect of it is this is how you have to understand the Syrian conflict, because the way Qatar and Turkey view this is that it finally gives them the real potential, especially with the weakening of Iran, through access of the Sunni tribes and Sunnis in Iraq, to have a potential link between Qatar, Syria, and Turkey, to bring pipelines into Turkey and into Europe, to make Europe dependent on Qatari gas, and essentially anchor that strategic corridor that China wants to build to also an economic corridor that Europe has to depend on. And Europe altogether feels that Turkey is emerging as a country it can't afford to offend at this point. So China is now weaseling into that to try to ride with Turkey into the European structures. I would keep a very close eye on these pipelines, these energy discussions going on between Qatar, Syria, and Turkey, because I think they have this major strategic dimension. And unfortunately, the West is not thinking about the alternative pipeline structures and energy structures, which are the UAE to Israel structures that hook up on one side, also go out to India, and on the other side, the Greece and Europe. So I think that we're just not paying attention to this major strategic competition. The second thing is how that then links up to Africa. There's the Great Lakes region of Africa, which is really the game there, is critical raw materials and rare earth minerals. And China really has dominance there. We're not really even in the game. And Russia's north of that, but to some extent, again, not complete alignment with China. And then north of that, again, you have North Africa, which is the real effort by Turkey now to consolidate its position. So between that, under Turkish control, and China working in Central Africa, the central part of Africa, you see how this is really in the Belt and Road now has a major African component that flows through Turkish power. So at any rate, I'll leave it at that, and I think better the rest brought out in question and answer.
David, wonderful. This is such a rich, tapestry, I suppose, of various elements of this great game that is underway now, with the Chinese very much in the mix. One thing we'll want to come back to in Q&A with you is the role that Egypt is playing in all of this as well. The Turkish-Egyptian dynamic is especially interesting, as is much of what you said. So we'll cover a lot of that in further discussion momentarily, I think. But before we do, I wanted to again, no stranger to these programs, Charles Sam Faddis, who I had the privilege of speaking with on our television show, Securing America on Real America's Voice, for the program that will air tomorrow morning. And he was gracious enough to say we could use a portion of it for this purpose as well. Focus on the Chinese-Iranian relationship. Mention's been made of it by several of our presenters, but we wanted to do a bit deeper dive with Sam. And we have how this relationship is evolving at the moment of Iran, thanks principally to Israel's efforts and some of the sanctions that the Trump administration has applied. The threat is nonetheless continuing to metastasize with the help of the Chinese Communist Party. So let's go to the video. Time for our friend Charles Sam Faddis.
In Iran, these guys have a long-standing entanglement. I mean, the Chinese were involved with the Iranian nuclear program 30 years ago. Economic entanglement, military, conventional entanglement. So there is an existing strong relationship there that provides all sorts of options to the Chinese and obviously also provides resources to the Iranians. So to zero in on the idea of how this might play out in the context of the Iranian nuclear program and the negotiations, if you will, that are ongoing between Iran and the United States. We, the United States government, are not just negotiating with the Iranians. Donald Trump has been very clear. He gave them a specific deadline, which we are rapidly approaching, that they would either get serious and we'll have a deal and things will be happening, or they won't and they will face really stern consequences. And we have moved military resources and all kinds of reporting about bombers flying into Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean and C-17s landing in Israel, and preparation for some kind of big upcoming operation against the Iranians, and with the idea that we're going to strike their nuclear facilities. That's presuming we know where all their nuclear facilities are. So we don't actually know the status of the Iranian nuclear program. We don't know that they don't already have a nuclear weapon, and we certainly don't know that they're not going to detonate one of their own design in the midst of these negotiations, which sort of resets the table. But let's, bringing in the Chinese factor, which is what we're focusing on, is the Chinese have been involved in proliferation of nuclear technology for a long time. They effectively gave the Pakistanis the nuclear weapons. And they have, as I said before, provided significant assistance to the Iranians in the past. And I mean assistance that you could not possibly color as being connected to the peaceful use of nuclear technology. Assistance with specific pieces of equipment and techniques and so forth that are only relevant to nuclear weapons. In other words, they made a decision a long time ago. They want the Iranians to have the bomb, and they have helped them at critical juncture. Okay, so let's assume that with everything that's going on in the world right now, with the tension between us and the Chinese, the pressure the Chinese are feeling, forget about assistance. What if a Chinese aircraft lands in Iran and delivers to them multiple nuclear weapons, a dozen weapons, which are then mated to missiles and drones and dispersed throughout the country at locations that we don't know, the Israelis don't know, nobody knows. And now all of a sudden, the entire situation in the Middle East has radically changed. Because this whole business about just teeing off on Iran, we're going to bomb them back to the Stone Age, changes, because if you start that and you don't know for sure where every one of those nukes is, then potentially Tel Aviv, Riyadh, God knows how many other places are vaporized in response. It is a dramatic step. So do I have concrete evidence that the Chinese are doing that right now? I'm not saying that I do. I'm saying it's an option that I think we ought to really think about, that we have, Donald Trump has decided to radically alter the playing field, change the entire relationship between us and the Chinese that was established decades ago, where they just sort of get unfettered access to our market. And at risk is really the whole fate of modern China, right? I mean, you're talking about bankrupting the CCP. So I think we ought to be prepared for potentially very significant and dramatic responses to that action. Americans default to thinking of this trade war, again, if that's the term we should use right now, as being all about the price of goods and balance of payments, and it's a commercial economic thing, because they're assuming that the Chinese motives are effectively the same as ours, which is economic prosperity. Well, you're talking about the Chinese Communist Party, and as you noted, that is not their prime motive. That is not their focus. That is not what they care about. That may be means to an end, but their end is world domination. That's where they're going. Are the Iranians incredibly important to them? Yeah, they have not just strategic location, but vast military resources, oil. It's also point out that the Iranians means all of the Iranian proxies, Hezbollah and all of the groups in Iraq and everywhere else. The Iranians have a worldwide network via the Quds Force and Hezbollah and all that extends into Venezuela, that extends onto the soil of the United States of America, right? These guys have the capacity and do regularly set the world on fire all over the place. And having worked against them extensively, they are not bums. They are not slouches. These guys are not a joke. They are absolutely ruthless, but they are absolutely professional as well. So this is not just like some Bush League team that you're helping out with. This is a major power. I mean, before the Islamic Revolution, what was Iran to us? Iran, once upon a time when the Shah was in power, was kind of the key pillar of our entire Middle East strategy, right? Which is why it was such a massive deal when Jimmy Carter let the Shah fall. So they are a huge asset to the Chinese. This is not an inconsequential relationship.
It's not inconsequential, and it could be very deadly indeed, especially as we come to grips with certainty. I feel that we will not disarm the Ayatollah and his regime through negotiations. If they can be disarmed, I think it has to be as a result of bringing them down, not even just trying to whack the various moles of the facilities that we think we know about. And you're right, Sam, as you understand better than anybody, our knowledge is not perfect. Even the Israelis is not perfect and can change at a moment's notice.
I agree.
Sam Faddis, and conversation is worth hearing the rest of it if I can put in a shameless plug for our program. Once again, Securing America on Real America's Voice. It'll air tomorrow morning, very early. We will be finally concluding this program with comments from another of our regular contributors in these programs, I'm pleased to say, Captain Jay Bolton, a merchant Marine veteran of many years, qualified as master of very big ships and tall ships as well. He is a man who has spent a considerable amount of his time at sea in some of the waters that we're talking about here. And since leaving the Merchant Marine, has been actively involved in some business enterprises and consulting in the Horn of Africa. And we asked him to join us to give us his perspective on a place in the region that is, as I understand it, the first permanent overseas military base of the People's Liberation Army, a naval installation in Djibouti, which happens to be uncomfortably close to a U.S. military base, a Marine Corps installation in that very critical part of the world. We've been talking about Yemen, we've been talking about the Red Sea, we've been talking about the Suez Canal, we've been talking about in which the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese are demonstrating their power projection capabilities. Much of this was made possible in the first instance with our encouragement, as I recall, bringing the Chinese into counter-piracy activities, which led in turn to their getting this space in Djibouti. Captain Bolton, we're delighted to have you with us. Thank you for providing the other programs and other presentations, I should say. And we're delighted to turn the floor over to you now, sir.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to work with you again. I want to give you a brief overview of all the topics that these other panelists have presented, and then talk a little bit about Djibouti. But a biggest concern to me is, what do we do? What's the next step? With all of this information assembled, how can we get this to the hands of our legislators? That's kind of what's on my mind. Let me preface a little bit of my background. I had spent since 2011 working with many Somalia citizens, Somali American citizens, working with people in the Somalia government. The whole mission there was to find a way to establish the rule of law in the maritime domain. And because they lacked a coast guard, they lacked rules and regulations, and they lacked infrastructure. From that, I encountered many of the ambassadors to Somalia, and my takeaway was that there was a lack of proactivity on their sense of how to address the root cause. Now that takes the root cause of the piracy, root cause of this, and that all comes to lack of business ability to generate business for the people through fishing industry, through other various elements. That led me to Djibouti, which is next door to Somaliland. And that's when I quickly realized that they too, all the people that I have encountered, are looking to America for a solution. And we have not given them that solution. So I want to give you just a PowerPoint, just a few slides that just summarizes what all these other gentlemen have been talking about in macro that you can refer back to and as a memory enhancer to understand. So let me just go through some of these slides a little bit. Over the years, China's developed this massive global port network that your panelists have spoken about. And if you look at that, the question is, how did that happen? How did so many administrations go through history and not address this situation? Next slide. Another example of the military footprint. So we look at these things, and again, all the specific information we've been given from the Navy perspective, from the Egyptians, the Turks, and things like that, we have to wonder what happened. And Djibouti, the viewers probably know, is right adjacent to Somaliland or Somalia, critical area. And so when the people in Djibouti turn to help, economic help, they turn to the Chinese. So as a result of that, the Chinese have given billions of dollars for infrastructure development. They basically control Djibouti with their debt. And they're doing major infrastructure projects going on into Ethiopia. And that gives cause to wonder, with all of that control that the Chinese have just in Ethiopia and Djibouti, and now coming to Somalia, they own the entire Horn of Africa. And Dr. Wormsed addressed the Iranian and Turkey issues. Turkey is working very closely with the Somalia government, oil rights and things like this. There is no American influence, and there are all these countries saying, where is America? So in Djibouti, we have the military base, no economic support given to Djibouti government, and the relations are not good. So we can't blame the Chinese for taking advantage of what we didn't do. That's my basic premise. Next slide. Okay, our panelists have addressed these issues. Losing, China's winning. It's amazing. One thing I've encountered in dealing with all of the ambassadors and whatnot, the finance or the business leg of the stool is missing, has been missing for years. Our ambassadors, they don't go out and promote American companies to the degree that they should. And so without that, all the military work is done through AFRICOM and things like that, I think it's not going to succeed, because the people in these countries, they're looking for help. And they're not getting it. All they're getting is the bombs and Al-Shabaab and things like that. One of the key things that I think could be very helpful would be the use of counter trade, using the country's natural resources, where we provide the money for infrastructure at no net cost to taxpayer, but we recapture that through the counter trade. And I think there's a way that we could turn many of these countries in Africa back to an American ally, and that's what they're looking for. So the question is, what do we as citizens, how do we communicate with the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs and other decision makers within our government to get them to be more proactive in the business element while we're doing the political element and the military element? And that's a question that's unanswered. That's all I have right now. Over.
Capt. Bolton, have two of our guests still with us, and we're going to do a brief round of Q&A with them. And again, we're very grateful to you for sticking with us. David Wormser, a topic that we had hoped to have a guest cover, but he had a family emergency arise and was unable to participate, is Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis, of course, are a key member of OPEC, arguably the dominant or in OPEC. There's reason to believe that Egyptians, if they have not actually changed sides, they are at least hedging their bets. Could you talk a bit about how the Saudi-U.S. relationship during the Biden years, and again, as Captain Bolton just talked about in the context of Djibouti, the extent to which the Chinese have or at least exploited some of the strains thus created?
Yeah, sure. Well, to understand the Chinese, the Saudis, you have to understand. Yeah, think about tribes, and I'm not talking about intricacies of this tribe or that tribe. If you're a tribe and you're a tribal leader, you have one objective as the leader of the tribe, which is to protect the welfare of your tribe against other tribes, many of whom are trying to kill you or wipe you out. So you're always looking for the stronger tribe to align with. The Saudis had found that tribe already under Roosevelt and on, and that was the United States and Britain, and especially the United States after the 50s. This was shaken by Carter first, but then later, much more profoundly, by Obama and then Biden. Carter shook it in the sense that when America was weak in the region and lost its way, we were an ally that couldn't be counted on, and they had essentially attached their cart to a lame horse, which is a bad place to be if you're in the Middle East. That was bad enough, but what you saw under Obama was we turned hostile. We turned hostile to Saudi Arabia, to the idea of Saudi Arabia, to the royal family of Saudi Arabia. This really came to a head in the first year or two of the Biden administration. And the Saudis could accept the Carter era and then slowly rebuild their confidence in us. But this second time around, you fool me once, shame on you. You fool me twice, shame on me. The Saudis already were skeptical. But now this hostility, I think it really broke something fundamental in Saudi trust of the United States. And look, I mean, I'm an American patriot. I don't think we owe anybody an apology for anything. And the Saudis should read the writing on the wall in the long term. But that said, I can understand where they're coming from, that they're scared that the United States is simply not going to be there. So they're looking to hedge, and their hedge is China. China for two reasons. One is that China has economic interests that could make them want to side with Saudi Arabia, but also more importantly, China has this strategic relationship with Iran and Turkey, and therefore they need the Chinese to intervene with their own clients, so to speak, to restrain them against Saudi Arabia. And what this means is this is the Chinese entry point to create a Pax Sinica rather than a Pax Americana in the region. And that's the real danger. We're losing Saudi Arabia, and with it would come probably in the long run also the UAE. The second thing is, as the Iran threat fades or is destroyed by Israel, the other big threat China faces, which is Turkey, emerges both through the Horn of Africa, as brilliantly described by Captain Bolton, but also by the possibility of Egypt. Egypt has always been in the inner circle of Saudi strategic concerns. So I think the Saudis simply have no confidence, even under President Trump at this point, to be strategically robust. They hear the isolationist voices. They hear the crowd here who's arguing for appeasing Iran, for appeasing Qatar, for working with Turkey, and they read that in many ways, they look at Israel as the canary in the mine for themselves. If the United States doesn't stand resolutely with Israel, then certainly they don't have confidence that the United States would stand resolutely with them. So at the end of the day, what you're seeing is the damage done not only by the Biden team and by the Obama team, but by Obama-like policies that are being advocated by certain people within within the conservative camp in the United States as well. And the Saudis are reading that, and they're hedging, and they're not going to commit to anything, including, in my view, a very essential thing, which is to help us in the war in Yemen. I mean, the only way we're bogged down unless we get Yemen to, with Saudi Arabia, to physically on the ground finish the job against the Houthis. And right now, the Saudis are afraid that we're not going to follow it through because they read our internal debate. So I think the Saudis are very terrified. They're not confident, and they're drifting toward China. And if they can get a Pax Sinica, then they'll go for it, because simply there's no sentiment here. This is business for them. This is the business of survival for them. And if China can offer them a path to shutting down their enemies, then they, as a fairly weak country, will go by it that way.
Thank you, David. You combine all of that strategic with the BRICS angle, and it's clear that we are at risk of jeopardizing a lot in this part of the world by failing to restore the U.S.-Saudi relationship to what it was prior to team's arrival. The president headed there, and this will presumably be a high priority for that visit. And I think we want to wish him well in pursuing that goal. Captain Bolton, you strong appeal towards the end there for supporting American businesses in this region, not just Djibouti, not just I guess the Middle East for that matter, but Africa as well. I know you've had personal experience with this. Could you talk briefly about the facilities that we have, the mechanisms, the institutions, the financing arrangements, and the like, that beyond having diplomats just be attentive to the need to promote our businesses, can actually enable that to be done in a much more offensive way than is true at the moment.
The issue, if we look at USAID and the money that is lost, the money that goes in the pockets of the corrupt politicians, in my view, there's only one solution, and that is to use the funds, wherever they become available, to employ U.S. companies to go in and build the infrastructure, be it port development, power generation, water, and whatnot. No money to go to the respective African country. And then by doing so, we get the infrastructure built, the people start making a living, and then we can walk away because we will pay for that with their existing natural resources. So for example, in Somalia, the concept was to have them deed the 80 billion barrels of proven oil reserves and the uranium reserves to the U.S. government to be titled to them. And that way we could sell that stuff through counter trade and pay for the infrastructure. It bypasses the government with certain terms and conditions. So that's the basic concept, because right now the money disappears from USAID, the Europeans, the New Deal. There's billions of dollars was pledged to Somalia, which we're familiar with, disappeared basically. $3 million was given to the Mogadishu Maritime Training Center. The center was never built. So we've got to fight the corruption, and that's got to be strong U.S. leadership, which I believe needs to be a coordinated effort, not just by state, but by Commerce Department and Defense working together. And I spoke about that in the previous webinar about the silos of bureaucracy. We've got to get them to work together with a concerted effort. Unfortunately, most recently, just a few days ago, I learned that one of the funds that had been allocated was through the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and Trump is dissolving that. There's a big question mark what's going to happen with that organization. But my view is we need an NGO, a nonprofit NGO that transcends different administrations to get the job done in the name of the United States. And that's the only way that I think we can really counter the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Over.
Thank you. I do want to come back on BRI with you in a moment, but before we do, David, we done this earlier. Could you explicate a little bit more his role in this complex environment as it relates to Egypt? Both of them seem to be aligning more and more with China, obviously, but also this axis that includes Iran. There is, however, a fairly strong rivalry between these two nations, is there not? And if so, how is that playing into the dynamics you're talking about?
Well, I think the key here to understanding it, on one side, you have Egypt traditionally being the nemesis, or really Erdogan and Turkey being the nemesis of Egypt. And that goes back to the early part of the last decade when you had the Muslim Brotherhood, which was deeply intertwined with Erdogan, and part of his strategy, take over Cairo, take over Egypt. And after about a year and a half, 2 years of that government, the UAE, the Saudis, and the Egyptian military's top level conspired to overthrow the Morsi government and oust the Muslim Brotherhood, and essentially teeing up. It was part of the other strategic competition in the region that nobody was paying attention to. The Iran one took so much attention that nobody was paying attention to Turkey's competition with Saudi Arabia, which also included Jordan. The Jordanians were terrified about what was happening with Turkey and the destabilization that they were doing, as well as what was going on in the Horn of Africa. Jordan has a huge tradition of being involved in the Horn of Africa. So they were paying very close attention and seeing a great deal of strategic threat. They were cooperating with the Saudis on that. Anyway, going back to Egypt, when they overthrew Morsi, al-Sisi overthrew Morsi, obviously that teed up Egypt as the strategic enemy of Erdogan and all his regional plans. So there was this tremendous rivalry. And you could count on that. It affected the Egyptian cooperation with Israel and the United States on Hamas, for example. And you could keep the Hamas problem somewhat contained and dangerous, but not catastrophic the way it's become. And we counted on that reality persisting, and we weren't paying attention to the fact that underneath in Egypt, it's a dysfunctional state. And underneath, the Muslim Brotherhood was gaining traction. The Egyptian top leadership was still against the Muslim Brotherhood, but underneath, the Muslim Brotherhood was essentially taking over systematically the institutions of the Egyptian state. And there comes a certain point where the Egyptian government realized it, and it started trying to appease that rather than confront it. It didn't have the power anymore to confront it. And to appease it, one of the things they did was they threw away the cooperation with Israel. Israel didn't pick up on this. And it's one of the things that needs to be investigated and is bursting into the public now about October 7th. The Israelis counted on the Egyptians of old. And they had an Egyptian of new, which was no longer cooperating with them, but was actually cooperating with Hamas. So that was one element of appeasement. The second thing is they toned down the rhetoric on Egypt and on Turkey. And third, they stopped being as aggressive in North Africa, trying to challenge the Turks. So they essentially tried to shut down those problems and appease the Muslim Brotherhood. I think in the end, now, Egypt is in a bad place. That appeasing it without getting some sort of Turkish buy-in won't work. This tiger is going to eat them. It's going to buck, knock them off their back, and this tiger will consume them. You can't ride the tiger's back anymore. So I think what Egypt is turning to is this is the key to switching sides. It is going to China to intervene with Turkey to shut down the Turkish problem. And that, of course, makes Remember, Egypt made peace in the 70s to begin with because they read these global tectonics between the United States and the Soviet Union. They're reading these tectonics with Turkey, with China, with the United States. And their appreciation at this point is all those things that were built on anchoring to the United States are now obstructions to their coming to terms with China and through China buying off the Turkish tiger that they're facing in the Horn of Africa and internally. So my sense is the price that will be paid ultimately is going to be peace with Israel. And you're already seeing it. Essentially, what they did with Hamas was a belligerent act, and what they're doing now, training with the Chinese in the Sinai, and potentially quite seriously violating the peace treaty this way. You're seeing all the writings on the wall. They're switching sides, and they're switching sides because they need China now, and because they need China to shut down Turkey. So I think that's the real dynamic going on there, and we're not picking up on it.
This is an incredibly important point, and it complements, I think, very well what Rabbi Pesach Wolicki said earlier. Thank you, David, for helping clarify the Turkish gambit here. Let me conclude, Jay, with you. You have mentioned, as have others, the importance of this Belt and Road Initiative of China's. We're told that in its present financial difficulties, the amount of money that it is applying to building out this infrastructure, and much of it related to power projection, as you've indicated, but it once was. I did just want to mention and ask you to respond to it. One of the ways in which this Belt and Road scheme has been financed to date, I believe, is from American investors who have unwittingly been pouring money into Chinese companies thanks to a 2013 memorandum of understanding that was engineered by Joe Biden when he was vice president of the United States. We've talked about it on these programs with some regularity, but there's been an important development, I think, and it's worth noting in this context, and I'd like to get your reaction to it if I can. This memorandum was signed off on by a sort of subsidiary element of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, PCAOB, with the Chinese counterparts, the Chinese Securities Regulation Commission, and the Ministry of Finance of China, as I say, back in May of 2013. And by some estimates, as a result of essentially the preferential access that MOU gave the Chinese Communist Party's companies to the U.S. capital markets, access that no American company enjoys, access that no other countries' companies coming to our capital markets enjoys, namely the opportunity to simply ignore our securities laws and regulations, which are overwhelmingly, I believe, designed to protect investors from fraud or corporate mismanagement or lack of accountability or a combination of them. The point is that several days ago now, the new chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Paul Atkins, was sworn in to take on that responsibility. He'd been a commissioner in the past. He's now the chairman of the commission. He did it in the Oval Office, by the way, in the presence of the president, sworn in by the Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent. And on the occasion, he made the point, not once, but I think twice, that he had made in his confirmation hearings. Namely, that he regarded it as his first duty as chairman to protect our investors. So I just wanted to say on behalf of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, which has been arguing strenuously for, well, all of its existence, 6 years now, that we stop underwriting our enemy, the Chinese Communist Party, that this is something that Paul Atkins could do immediately and should, in furtherance of his duty as chairman, namely to rescind this memorandum of understanding between the PCAOB and China, again, made possible by the operation and influence of then Vice President Joe Biden. And I just want to say that in case it had not caught your attention, 6 months after that memorandum was adopted, Joe Biden and his son, Hunter, went to Beijing. And Hunter came back with $1.2 billion to invest on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party in buying up, in some cases, sensitive companies here. I personally believe this is an example of the corruption that characterized so much of the Biden administration's behavior and, you know, its leader, nominal leader, at least, conduct as well. So just finishing up, Jay, to you. As you look at what's happening with the Belt and Road Initiative, if indeed it is the case that the Chinese financial situation is impinging upon it, one of the other things it seems to me that could be very helpfully done here, starting perhaps with Paul Atkins' action on this MOU, is to stop the financing, directly or indirectly as it may be, of the BRI by unwitting, mostly at least, unwitting American investors. Your thoughts, sir, and particularly how important it would be to curb this enterprise, if we can.
Well, yeah, two parts, Frank. I think number one is my experience with the Somali people, which is extensive right now. They're looking for leadership. They're looking for help. They want to develop their fishing industry. They want to develop their commerce and trade. They have a whole shopping list of things they want to do, and they're looking for help. And you know, when a sailor falls over the side of the ship, he doesn't care where he gets a life jacket. So now that China's money is drying up, now's the time for us to move quickly and effectively to show these developing countries that we can do this with American technology and American companies. So right now is a critical time that we move quickly, and that's why I'm a little concerned about the Millennium Challenge Corporation being dissolved. We need to have a private sector group that can move overnight, and I have utmost confidence that while the Chinese are pulling back because of lack of funding capabilities and other issues, they will jump to the United States. But we have to do something other than just words and flowers and from our ambassadors.
Jay Bolton, thank you. David Wormser, thank you. And to all of our other contributors, this has been a very important presentation, especially with the President of the United States heading to the region very shortly. It is of paramount importance that I think he understands the opportunities that we've discussed here, true nature of some of the nations that he's going to be interacting with, especially Qatar, and the dangers of allowing the region to continue its present drift into the arms of, and perhaps the control of, the Chinese Communist Party. To our great detriment, yes, of course, that of Israel, certainly, but also, I would argue, the region more broadly and the free world as well. With that, we're going to say thank you to all of you for being with us. As always, your participation in these programs, not only in observing them, but helping pass them around to others, is incalculably important. We urgently need your help in raising, the awareness, yes, but also the alarm about what the Chinese Communist Party is up to. And with your help, I'm confident that decisions will be properly made by this administration and hopefully the Congress as well to attend to the Middle East front in World War Xi, but more importantly, to help us prevail in it globally as well. With that, thank you. God bless you all. Back to Didi.
Thank you, Frank. And thanks to all of you for being here today. A webinar of this webinar will be posted to presentdangerchina.org within a day or so of the program's conclusion. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. For webinar notices, updates, and news, subscribe to our Substack at presentdangerchina.substack.com and follow us on X at CPD China. Join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world and how CCP captured elites betray the USA. Thanks for joining us today, and goodbye.